Greetings and welcome. We are in Freshman Honors English, and our agenda now for the hour is to introduce you to the second semester of work, and more particularly our study specifically out of our hymnal. To this point, we really haven't spent a lot of time in our hymnal, with the exception of our study of the Odyssey and, I believe, Romeo and Juliet. Beyond that, we really haven't used our textbook very much, and so I want to do two things this hour. One, I want to introduce the concepts that we will be playing with now early on in what we will call, for lack of a better phrase, plot and plot development. Okay, and we'll be critiquing plot and the like. Two, we want to talk specifically about how we will use our textbook as a guide for the exegesis, the hermeneutics, the interpretation, the critique. That's a part of what we do when we pick up a text out of our textbook and we look at it. Now, let's remind ourselves of what we're seeing when we pick up our textbook. This is what we call, let's put this word in our notes, an anthology. Now, what does that term even mean? What is an anthology? Does anybody know what that word means? An anthology is what? Anybody know? When you look at your hymnal, is that like a novel? No? Okay, good. So you got it. It's the word collection. That's the key word right there. The word collection. So anytime you're talking about an anthology, you're talking about a collection of something. Right? So when you've got a whole group of different types of something put together, you can use the phrase anthology. Now, our high school anthologies, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, are color-coded. And you've seen this. So, for example, if you've got any senior pals walking around, they hold a green volume that looks very similar to yours. If you've got junior pals walking around, they have an orange volume that looks like yours, right? Okay? The sophomore volume is purple, I believe, right? Purple color. And then, of course, the freshman volume is your kind of teal-green color, right? Okay. Now, what are these anthologies? Well, these anthologies are collections of writings of different genre. Now, just use another important word. What does that word genre mean? Does anybody know what that word means? Types. You got it. Types of literary texts. Within any one of our anthologies or collections, you can find poems there. You can find short stories, what we'll often refer to as short fiction. You can find essays there. And, of course, you can find plays, as we discovered when we studied Romeo and Juliet. Now, in the freshman and the sophomore year, see, this is important that you kind of learn how to look at these anthologies. In the freshman and the sophomore year, the anthologies are thematically collected. Thematically. In other words, you have groups of units that are collected around themes. Okay, themes. So, in other words, you'll have a certain kind of question or idea that will be presented, and then you'll have a group of writings. Sometimes some poems, sometimes some stories, sometimes some essays, etc. Okay? In the freshman and the sophomore year. That's how it's driven. In the junior year, the anthology is the work of American authors only. Got me? So we'll have American authors in our junior year. All right? So if you see any of your junior pals walking around with their anthology and you flip open to the table of contents, you'll immediately identify only American authors. So in the junior year, you'll study with me just American writers. In the senior year, that's the green anthology. In the senior year, we study only British authors. Okay? British authors. Writers from England. Okay? Now, truly, if you're studying with me in your senior year at the honors level, we'll study quite a bit more than just British authors, because it's really a world lit text, world lit survey. And so we're working with everything from Plato and Aristotle and the Greek writers all the way up to modern 20th century writers, both British, American, and then others as well. You know, so for example, we read our Tolstoy in our senior year and that kind of thing in that class as well. All right? So I've given you kind of an overview. Now let's talk specifically about what we will look at when we look at our freshman anthology. We will begin by closely scrutinizing, analyzing, and interpreting short fiction texts primarily short fiction text. We'll look at a little bit of essay writing, but primarily we're going to give our attentions to the work of short fiction. Now, to this point, we really haven't done a lot of this. To this point in our time together, we've been studying primarily, right, working primarily with Greek and Roman mythology. Remember, that's our use of Edith Hamilton's mythology, correct? Then we picked up our text of the Odyssey, and that really is what we will call an epic poem, right? We made some reference to the Iliad, but mostly we were reading from the Odyssey. And then finally we picked up a work of drama, a dramatic work, that we will call, first of all, Romeo and Juliet, second of all, Midsummer Night's Dream, right? And so that's kind of the work that we did in the first semester. Now we're going to turn in the second semester, and we're going to begin to pay close attention to what we call short fiction, okay? And then a little bit later, we're going to pick up some poetics, and we're going to start looking at poetry. And then along the way, we'll also study, of course, the non-fiction essay, okay? And we'll talk about that as well. Okay? And that'll be kind of the trajectory of our course. So over the course of now the next, 16 weeks or so, we'll pick up and we'll study some texts. Now, if you've got your hymnal in front of you, and it probably makes sense that you might have your hymnal in front of you, you might want to open to the table of contents and just take a look and notice that the textbook is divided up into units. Do you see that? So go ahead and open your hymnal and identify that we got units. Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, etc., right? By the way, good readers learn how to read their table of contents. It's kind of like a road map, isn't it? It's a bit of cartography of a text to help you to know how to look at a text. Notice those questions at the top of the units. Do you see that? So you've got questions associated with a unit, don't you? Right? Okay? And then you're going to have a series of texts that will somehow play a role in answering that question, whatever that question is. I believe they even highlight it for you with a little question mark in a circle or something like that, right? Now, because there are no novels presented in your anthology, we've assigned novels outside of your anthology, right? So you have a series of them. I believe our first one is Ayn Rand's Anthem, correct? Right? And so you're reading these novels, and then you're taking AR tests as we go, all right? The exams that I'm giving to you, that you've looked at to create your master schedule, the exams that we're working with are specifically going to be driven by our textbook. Got me? So it becomes hypercritical that in our annotative process, we're paying attention to the questions at the end of the selections. Here's why. The questions that I'll be giving to you on the exam are made by the same company that makes these questions at the end of the readings. So going through the process of especially studying the vocabulary and the grammar and the style questions, that's why I'm assigning them to you. You want to make sure that you pay attention to them because those will look and sound a lot like the questions you're going to see on the exam. Make sense? Do you have any questions for me, logistic in nature, about the kinds of ways that we look at the textbook? Good. Then let's go ahead and look at the first, I believe, real text that we'll see. I believe it's Washerwoman. Am I right? There's some introductory materials and stuff, but I believe our first real text is Washerwoman. Let's go to page 26 real quickly. Actually, let's look at 22 to 25 just to make sure we understand. There's always going to be some introductory materials. Do you see at the top of page 22 it says, before you read? Does everybody see that? Raise your hand if you don't see that. I want to make sure you're with me here. You always want to pay attention to these pages before you read. Sometimes they're going to give us some vocabulary that you want to pay attention to, and they'll outline it. You always want to pay attention to these Common Core State Standards that are listed at the bottom of page 22. And then on to page 23, they're going to give you some stuff to look at. Go ahead, flip the page. Then we're going to get ready for a specific text. And notice on page, 24, we're going to have some do you see it there? Do you see that vocabulary work? You want to pay very close attention to that section. You want to include that in your pre-class reading notes at level 1. You want to write those words down. You want to make sure you know the definition of those words because I can guarantee you they're going to end up on the exam. And the last thing you want to do is to jack your test score because you didn't prep accordingly for it. And then notice over on the next page, they're always going to introduce the author to you. And at level 1, you always want to make sure that you just do a couple of bullet point notes about who it is that we're reading, okay? And then finally, we're ready for the actual study itself. Turn the page, and we're ready to engage in the actual text. Notice the first real text we'll look at is called The Washerwoman, okay? So we're going to look at Washerwoman, and then that will be our first text. And then notice as you flip through, there's notes on the side, footnotes at the bottom. Go ahead and flip through the pages to identify the ways in which they're trying to set you up to study the text Obviously, just like before, you're going to be taking notes at level 1 where you're just summarizing what you read. Then when you finish, you'll work with level 2A, which will involve possible themes and messages. 2B, we're always looking at some kind of rhetorical or literary technique stuff. And then, of course, 3A, how does this relate to other texts? 3B, how does this relate to me personally? All right, so we're doing the same kind of gig. We're only becoming more focused now, text by text, okay? So for those of you who are looking for full points on your read-write packet, you want to make sure that you're paying close attention to doing your annotations thoroughly. Then finally, notice a series of questions, and pretty much every reading is laid out the exact same way, okay? Do you have any logistic questions for me about an individual text? So one of the things you want to make sure that you're doing, I know on your master schedule, right, you're kind of putting down on a sheet of paper all of the exams, but one of the things you want to make sure you're doing is to always take a look and see how much actual work is there for this text. Some of you will be able to do the reading the night before. Others of you will say the reading is too long, and so I really need to be working my weekends, as some of you learned how to do in the first semester, working and using your weekends to try and at least get a bunch of the reading done, so that maybe you're just doing the annotations of the questions the night before, so you don't have as much work. Remember, you got to balance your reading with the annotations with the reading of your novels, right? So you don't want to forget about those novels and all of a sudden come up your 2 days from the AR test and like, oh no, I got to get all the novel read. You don't want to do that. So you want to read a little bit every night out of your novel, and then of course stay up with the work of the anthology. Okay? Now the normal protocol for me then will be when we come to class, the first thing I'll expect you to do is to take out your annotations. That's pre-class work. In other words, you've already done the work over Washwoman. You've read it on your own. So that when we come to class, the assumption is you've already read the text, right? Which will allow for me then to immediately jump into a conversation with you. All right? Questions about any of that? Okay, so that's the first thing I said I'd do. Now I'm ready to go to the second thing. The second thing that I want to do with you is I want to talk about a schemata, or a way of understanding short fiction text. And to do that, we got to talk a little bit about this thing called plot. So let's go there. Okay? Plot. So we're going to write this intel down on our notes there, and we're going to work through it. Now, once I give you information, I hold you responsible for that information. In other words, one of the easy ways that I can have you talk about a work of short fiction is to talk about its plot. Now I'm going to give a definition, narrative structure. It's narrative structure. Now, what do I mean when I use that term? What is a narrative structure? What do I mean when I talk about plot? Well, some people will call this the map of the story. That's not a bad way to talk about it. The map of the story. And I'm going to guess, just because I know how well you've been educated in your 8th grade year, I'm going to guess that when this idea was instructed to you the first time, it was probably taught to you something like that. Am I right or wrong? Okay, yeah. So the first time that you probably, and this is the way we teach it to children, and so I'm going to use this. By the way, this concept comes from a great German dramaticist named Friedeck, who kind of pointed out that when you study stories, there is almost always an identifiable beginning, middle, and end. Which is interesting. When you study stories in the Western tradition, they have almost always an identifiable beginning, middle, end, and we kind of can chart those. We can kind of point out certain things happen. Now, it is a hallmark of modern, postmodern fiction that what I'm about to outline gets jacked around with and played with. Okay? And there's one of the ways we talk about modern texts is they kind of don't always follow this model. But by and large, most texts that we will study have an identifiable beginning, some kind of middle, and some kind of end. All right? So we want to identify the parts of all of this so that when we begin to look at stories, we can say, do the stories that we're working with have some of this? What do we call this first part? We can call it the beginning, but there's another word. What is it? Exposition. The exposition. Yeah, the exposition. Now, at least 3 things happen in the exposition, right? We're set up in regards to 1, characters, right? We're set up in regards to place, or sometimes called setting, right? And then what's the third one? You always are involved in understanding some sense of, somebody know? Yeah, you're right, Bumstar. Time. Good. Time. In other words, the story is either told in the past, the present, or the future, right? Okay? So, for example, when you pick up any text early on, you want to ask this question, what time is the story set? See? Right? So, for example, sometimes it's not always clear when a story is set. Sometimes a story will seem to be set in the present, but it's actually in the future. Or it will seem to be set in the past and is actually in the future. For those of you that read Lois Lowry's The Giver, you know what I'm talking about. You'll read that novel kind of sensing that it's a story from the past, and then all of a sudden you go, whoa, 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 this is a story, this is a futuristic story. This is actually set in the future. And so it sometimes will take a bit of time to figure that one out. We then have what's called the rising action, right? Correct? And what's central about the rising action is the issue of the introduction of the conflict. This becomes one of the central concerns for us, right? Conflict, every story, Freytag argued, I think rightfully so, has some sense of an internal dynamic struggle, a fight, something that has to be accomplished or overcome, and we'll use the academic term conflict. Of course, we have two kinds of conflict, don't we? Internal conflict and external conflict, right? And again, I'm going through this rather quickly. Dude, if what I'm talking about right now you've never heard before, you're in some serious trouble in our class. So you need to, get with me after class or whatever, and maybe we can debrief you and you can actually read some essays on this. I'm hoping for most of you this is like almost boring summary where you go, dude, I've heard this so many times. That's good if this is boring for you. That means we're reviewing material ground you've already been over. Let's make sure that we understand the language, the nomenclature. Internal conflict, character, as referenced by C, versus self, right? In other words, the character's got to come to terms with some internal kind of struggle. Okay? These can be stories where, for example, there is nobody else in the story other than a single character who is musing, thinking, working through, of course, predominantly psychological, right? That is related to the mind, okay? On the external side, we have three kinds that we normally reference, right? The first is what we'll call character versus character. Right? We're going to meet a famous story, Most Dangerous Game, which is a classic example of this. Secondly, we can have character versus some force of nature as represented by an N, right? This is the story where the person goes out in a little rowboat in the middle of the ocean and then struggles because a storm comes in, right? We'll think of those kinds of examples of stories. And finally, we can have character versus society or a group. And this can often have to do with group norms and the like, okay? So we can have different kinds of characters, now, or conflicts. Now, the discussion about conflict will be central to our conversations here, okay? So we will oftentimes identify these characters. Can you watch my whiteboard to see me do this? These characters that we're introduced to early on will all become involved in these kind of conflicts. But see, watch how all of a sudden I can go from very simple to a more complex question. For example, I want to just talk about the character who's quite intriguing in Midsummer Night's Dream, Bottom. Now, this is an intriguing character. Shakespeare has created for us a really remarkable character in Bottom. See, I could ask this question, what is the central conflict for Bottom in this play? What is the central conflict? Okay. Now, some of us will say, well, he's kind of coming to terms with the whole issue of being in the forest, where, of course, the fairies play kind of a fun game on him, and they turn, he's named Bottom, so why not turn his head into a donkey's head? That other word for donkey is ass, and so it's kind of 8th grade comedy, boys in the locker room comedy kind of thing, right? But what is the actual conflict that we're dealing with, okay? See, this could be a question we could ask. What is it that he's kind of coming to terms with, okay? So see, we could play that game. Or we can become even more sophisticated and ask about the conflict within the sub-story of Pyramus Thisbe, right? Because we got that at the end of the play. Or we can talk about this whole thing of what's going on with Helena and Hermia and the whole notion of trying to pick the right guy, that is to say, the guy you're actually in love with, okay? All of these can become part of this notion of conflict, all right? Notice the line that we even wrote about from Midsummer Night's Dream, the course of true love never did run smooth. That seems to suggest that there's always conflict when it comes to love, right? We can, of course, look as well at Romeo and Juliet from the same dynamic. So, for example, we could pick one character. Let's say, for example, the character of Friar Lawrence, who is an interesting character in that play, and ask, what is the central conflict, right, for Friar Lawrence? Okay? All right? Now, let's go to the next part of this project. We'll call it the climax of the text. Now, this is where our conversations in our freshman year start to become a little bit more erudite than maybe they were when you were younger. When you were younger, maybe they defined climax as what? What did they call it, usually? Did they teach it to you as the most exciting point in the story? Okay, that's a fairly easy way to teach children the concept of climax. But we're going to go ahead and move beyond a simpleton definition of climax. We are going to say that the climax is the fruition of the conflict. Okay? Fruition. Now, what does that word even mean? Fruition. Coming to terms with, or sometimes taught as, Mr. Raisin even did it like this, the turning point. Yeah, we can think of it that way. In other words, there is a moment when the conflict finally will come to something's got to give moment. Do you got me? Something's got to give moment. And it's at that moment that will qualify the climax of the text. Okay? But let's point something out. Great works of literature often have multiple conflicts. Do you agree with me? Great works, I mean, this is what makes Shakespeare so great. Shakespeare in Midsummer Night's Dream has examples of internal conflict, that's easy to find, as well as character versus character. We've even got mud fighting going on, hurrah. As well as character versus nature, of course, if you extend the fairies to be some component of nature, as well as, of course, the notion of do you obey your dad or don't you? Should a young lady do everything her father tells her to do? Well, we say, yeah, most of the time, but in the course of love, I mean, that's a whole different project. Or should she actually do what her dad tells her even though she doesn't want to? See, this is going to be an intriguing question for us. Notice, all those conflicts are a part of Midsummer Night's Dream. Depending on which one, then, of those conflicts you focus on, the climax of that play will be different. So, for example, if I were to ask you, what's the climax of the play Midsummer Night's Dream? Well, that all depends, right? I mean, some of you will say the climax of the play happens when, and then you'll start focusing on one conflict, right? And whenever that thing comes to its fruition, that's the climax of the play. What do you think is the climax of the play Romeo and Juliet? See, this is interesting, right? And again, immediately you find yourself saying, well, the climax is linked to the conflict. So which conflict do I have a tendency to focus on? Now, this is one of the interesting things about studying the humanities, and especially literature. You will discover that while you are absolutely certain of what the primary conflict of a text is, you may not be so certain that other people share your view. There might be a different, right, focus. What do you think is the climax of Romeo and Juliet? How many of you say the climax of Romeo and Juliet is early in the play or later in the play? How many of you say the climax of the play has to do with Romeo and Juliet meet for the first time? In other words, to use our little diagram, everything goes downhill after that. That's why they call it falling in love. They don't call it rising in love, they call it falling in love. So in other words, everything is great in Romeo's life and Juliet's life, right up to the point where they meet each other, and then some of you will say, no, it's later than that. It's probably the marriage, and more particularly the marriage night. So they get married, they do their thing. What do you think?
Actually, when Juliet
And they wake up in the morning.
Romeo's banishment after the killing of Tybalt.
Multiple, I don't know.
Tybalt. Yeah, right. And Nielsen even did it this way with her hands. There's multiple, right? Why does she do it this way, even with her hands like this? Because she's right. Depending on who you're focusing on. Notice, see, we come back. Watch, this is a way more complicated schemata than it was maybe taught to you in 7th and 8th grade. Depending on who you focus on here, you're going to have different conflicts you focus on. So, for example, if you want to study the play Romeo and Juliet and just study the development of Romeo character, right? Then we can ask, what kind of conflicts are you looking with Romeo? Well, what do you know? He definitely fights with himself, doesn't he? Definitely character versus character, no doubt about that. Interesting, some students will say, well, there's no real character versus nature. Really? How does he die?
Poison.
Where does the poison come from? Don't say an apothecary. It comes from a plant, doesn't it? Right? Poison comes from nature. And then, of course, no doubt, we got this notion of going against the will of the society that says, notice Paris, he's doing it the right way, Paris is, when he goes and requests the hand of Juliet to her father. That's how you're supposed to meet a girl and get married in Romeo's day, right? In Shakespeare's day.
Well, never mind. This isn't really it doesn't really have to do with plot, I guess.
the ideas here, as I'm presenting them to you, allow for us to have an exchange. Finally, for your notes. You have this thing that we'll call the falling action, the French word. Does anybody know it? Were you taught this word? What's the French word for the falling action? Starts with a D. The denouement. The denouement. The denouement is going, it's a French word, which just simply means the tying up, the bringing together, right? This is what we will often call, were you guys taught, if exposition was the word you were taught with, I'll just say over here. I'll write the first letter. How about it?
Resolution.
Yeah, very good. Resolution, right? So this is the resolution. See, you guys were taught well. Hey, you know what? You're through your first semester of your freshman year. It makes a lot of sense, especially on the humanities side and the language arts side, that you would go and find the person who instructed you in 8th grade and shake his or her hand and say, our instructor has suggested that we were taught well. And you were. I mean, the very fact that I'm able to have this kind of a level of speed of conversation with you tells me you were instructed well. You should tell those people thank you. Because at some point you're going to write a high ACT score, and part of the reason is going to be the work that those people did with you in 7th and 8th grade. So if you see them, tell them thank you, right? Because it matters that they help to educate you. Now the resolution sometimes involves a moral, but not always. In fact, we're going to qualify, the moral to the story is, the whole Aesop's fable thing, we're going to qualify that as a more classical approach. We probably don't use it as much anymore. Certainly when we write our own fiction, we do not step into the end of the story and say, now let me tell you what the story means. Okay? We don't do that kind of thing anymore. All right? Now Shakespeare himself will play a similar kind of game at the very end, of course, with Puck, but he's going to be kind of tongue-in-cheek as well. I hope you liked our play, and if you don't like it, just imagine that you were kind of stoned or something like that, right? Thanks, guys.